What happens when an entitled talk show host thinks she can lecture a Hollywood legend about respect, only to discover that some people refuse to be bullied on national television? Today, we're diving into the explosive confrontation that had Clint Eastwood walking off the View set, leaving Whoopi Goldberg speechless and the entire panel in complete shock. This isn't just another celebrity interview gone wrong. This is what happens when old-school Hollywood integrity meets modern-day cancel culture. And trust me, you won't believe how this legendary actor handled being disrespected on live TV. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below because this story gets more intense with every single word. The morning of October 15th started like any other day at the View Studios in New York City. The iconic daytime talk show was preparing for what they believed would be a routine promotional interview. Clint Eastwood, the 84-year-old director and actor, was scheduled to appear on the show to discuss his latest film project. The production team had briefed the hosts on keeping the conversation light and focused on entertainment. But what they didn't anticipate was Whoopi Goldberg's decision to turn the interview into a political battleground. As Eastwood settled into the guest chair, adjusting his signature dark jacket, the cameras began rolling for what would become one of the most talked-about moments in daytime television history. The panel consisted of the show's regular hosts, Whoopi Goldberg in the center moderator position, Joy Behar to her right, Sunny Hostin next to Joy, Sarah Haynes on the far right, and Alyssa Farah Griffin on Whoopi's left side. The studio audience, packed with mostly middle-aged women, applauded enthusiastically as Eastwood was introduced. Whoopi opened the segment with what appeared to be a warm welcome. "Clint Eastwood, welcome back to The View. It's always a pleasure to have you here." Her smile seemed genuine enough, but there was something in her tone that suggested she had an agenda beyond discussing his latest directing project. "Thank you for having me, Whoopi," Eastwood replied in his characteristic gravelly voice, maintaining the same composed demeanor that had defined his six-decade career in Hollywood. Sarah Haynes jumped in first with an innocuous question about his filmmaking process. "Clint, you've been directing for over 50 years now. What keeps you passionate about storytelling at this stage of your career?" Eastwood leaned back slightly, his weathered hands clasped together. "Well, Sarah, I think good stories are timeless. Whether you're making a Western or a war film, it's about finding the human truth in the situation. People connect with authenticity, not with whatever's politically fashionable at the moment." The comment was innocent enough, but Whoopi's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. She saw an opening. "That's interesting you mention what's politically fashionable," Whoopi interjected, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "Because your films have always had a very specific political perspective, haven't they? I mean, let's be honest about what kind of messages you've been putting out there for decades." The other panelists exchanged glances. This wasn't the direction they had discussed in the pre-show meeting. Joy Behar, never one to shy away from controversy, decided to pile on. "Whoopi's right, Clint. Your movies, especially the Dirty Harry series, they glorify a certain kind of vigilante justice that, frankly, in today's climate, seems pretty problematic. Don't you think it's time to acknowledge that?" Eastwood's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He had been in Hollywood long enough to recognize an ambush when he saw one. "I think you're misunderstanding what those films were about, Joy. They weren't about vigilante justice. They were about a man trying to do his job in a system that had failed the people he was sworn to protect." "But that's exactly the problem," Sunny Hostin jumped in, her voice rising with conviction. "That narrative of the lone wolf cop who has to break the rules to get justice, it's been used to justify police brutality for generations. Surely you can see how your films contributed to that culture." The studio audience was beginning to murmur. This was not the entertainment-focused interview they had expected to see. Eastwood remained calm, but his eyes had taken on the steely quality that had made him famous in countless westerns. "I think you're projecting modern politics onto stories that were made in a different time for different reasons," Eastwood said, his voice still measured but with an underlying firmness. "Art reflects the world as it is, not as we wish it were." This was exactly what Whoopi had been waiting for. She leaned forward, her voice dripping with condescension. "Oh, so now we're calling it art? Clint, with all due respect, your movies have perpetuated harmful stereotypes about masculinity, about violence, about how problems should be solved. And you've made millions doing it. Don't you think you have some responsibility to acknowledge that?" "With all due respect," Whoopi. Eastwood replied, emphasizing her name in a way that made it clear his patience was wearing thin. I think you're confusing entertainment with indoctrination. I've never told anyone how to think or how to vote. I've told stories. Stories have power, Clint. Alyssa Farah Griffin chimed in, trying to sound reasonable but clearly siding with her co-hosts. And when those stories consistently show violence as the solution, when they consistently show women as victims or prizes to be won, don't you think that has an impact? The legendary actor's composure was beginning to crack, though he maintained his outward calm. I've worked with strong women my entire career. I've directed films with complex female characters. I think you're cherry-picking examples to fit a narrative you want to push. Whoopi sensed blood in the water. She had succeeded in getting under his skin, and now she was going to go for the kill. Clint, I think what we're all trying to say here is that maybe it's time for you to evolve. Maybe it's time to admit that some of the messages in your films were harmful, especially to communities of color. I mean, let's talk about Gran Torino for a minute. That movie was full of racial slurs and stereotypes. How do you justify that? The question hung in the air like a loaded gun. Eastwood stared at Whoopi for a long moment, his famous squint more pronounced than usual. The studio had gone completely silent. Even the camera operators seemed to sense that something significant was about to happen. Justify it, Eastwood repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. I don't need to justify telling a story about a man confronting his own prejudices and learning to see past them. That film was about redemption, about growth, about finding common ground across racial divides. If you can't see that, then maybe the problem isn't with my film. Joy Behar couldn't resist jumping back in. But Clint, you can't just use racial slurs in a movie and then say it's okay because the character grows. That's not how it works anymore. People are hurt by that language, regardless of your intentions. And who appointed you the arbiter of what's acceptable in art? Eastwood shot back, his famous composure finally beginning to slip. Since when do talk show hosts get to decide what stories can be told and how they can be told? The tension in the studio was palpable now. The audience was completely silent, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. Whoopi wasn't backing down. If anything, Eastwood's pushback only emboldened her further. She sat back in her chair with a smug expression, clearly relishing the fact that she had rattled the Hollywood icon. Nobody appointed us anything, Clint, she said with a dismissive wave of her hand. But we have a platform, and we have a responsibility to call out harmful content when we see it. And frankly, a lot of your movies fall into that category. The violence, the outdated gender roles, the white savior narratives. It's all very problematic. Sarah Haynes, who had started the interview with softball questions, now felt compelled to join the pile-on. I think what Whoopi is trying to say is that times have changed, Clint. Audiences are more aware now of how media representation affects real-world behavior. Maybe it's time to acknowledge that some of your earlier work doesn't hold up to modern standards. Eastwood turned his steely gaze towards Sarah, and for a moment, she seemed to shrink back in her chair. Modern standards, he repeated slowly. You mean the standards where we tear down everything that came before us? Where we judge art made 50 years ago by the politics of today? Those modern standards? It's not about tearing down, Sunny Hostin interjected, her voice taking on a lecturing tone. It's about accountability. It's about recognizing that art doesn't exist in a vacuum. Your Westerns, for example, they romanticize a period of American history that was built on genocide and stolen land. Don't you see how that's harmful? The legendary director's hands gripped the arms of his chair tighter. My Westerns show the complexity of that period. The good, the bad, and the ugly, if you'll pardon the expression. They don't romanticize anything. They show human beings struggling with difficult choices in harsh circumstances. But they do romanticize it, Clint. Joy Behar pressed on. They romanticize the lone gunman, the rugged individualist who solves problems with violence. That's a very specific American mythology that has caused real harm in this country. Real harm. Eastwood's voice was getting harder now, his famous squint more pronounced. You want to talk about real harm? How about the harm done by people who think they can rewrite history to fit their political agenda? How about the harm done by destroying the careers of artists who don't conform to whatever ideological purity test is popular this week? Whoopi leaned forward again, sensing that she was getting to him. Nobody's destroying anyone's career, Clint. We're just asking you to take responsibility for the messages you've put out into the world. Is that really so unreasonable? What's unreasonable? Eastwood said, his voice now carrying the full weight of his 8 decades of life experience, is a group of people who have never created anything sitting in judgment of those who have. What's unreasonable is pretending that every story has to pass some kind of political litmus test before it can be told. Alyssa Farah Griffin tried to interject with what she thought was a more diplomatic approach. I don't think anyone's saying you can't tell stories, Clint. We're just saying that maybe there's a way to tell them that doesn't perpetuate harmful stereotypes or glorify violence as the solution to complex problems. Eastwood turned to look at her directly. And who decides what's harmful, Alyssa? You? The 5 of you sitting at this table? Some committee of approved thinkers? That's not how art works. That's not how creativity works. That's how propaganda works. The word propaganda hit the panel like a slap in the face. Whoopi's expression darkened considerably. Now wait just a minute, she said, her voice rising. Nobody here is promoting propaganda. We're promoting awareness, sensitivity, responsibility. Things that apparently your generation struggles with. My generation? Eastwood's voice was dangerously quiet now. My generation fought in wars to preserve the freedom that you're so eager to throw away. My generation built the entertainment industry that gave you the platform you're using to tear it down. Joy Behar couldn't let that pass. Oh please, Clint, don't give us the greatest generation speech. Your generation also gave us segregation, gave us the suppression of women's rights, gave us environmental destruction. Let's not pretend it was all heroic. And my generation also gave you the civil rights movement, Eastwood shot back. We gave you the women's liberation movement. We gave you the environmental movement. But I guess that doesn't fit your narrative, does it? Sonny Hostin jumped back in, clearly frustrated that Eastwood wasn't backing down. The point is, Clint, that we can acknowledge the good while also being honest about the bad. And a lot of your movies fall into the bad category when it comes to their social impact. Social impact, Eastwood repeated with obvious disdain. You know what has a social impact? Censorship, groupthink, the idea that artists should create only what's approved by the thought police. That has a social impact. Whoopi was getting visibly agitated now. This wasn't going the way she had planned. She had expected Eastwood to either apologize or at least show some contrition. Instead, he was fighting back harder than any guest she could remember. Nobody's talking about censorship, Clint, she said, her voice tight with frustration. We're talking about evolution. We're talking about growth. We're talking about learning from our mistakes. Whose mistakes? Eastwood asked pointedly. I stand by every film I've ever made. I stand by every story I've ever told. If you don't like them, don't watch them. But don't sit there and lecture me about mistakes when you don't have the first clue about what it takes to create something lasting. Sarah Haynes tried once more to find middle ground. But Clint, surely you can understand why some people might find certain elements of your films troubling in today's context. The casual violence, the lack of diverse voices, the traditional masculine archetypes. Traditional masculine archetypes, Eastwood repeated with a bitter laugh. You mean men who take responsibility for their actions? Men who protect those who can't protect themselves? Men who stand up for what's right even when it's difficult? Yeah, I can see why that would be troubling to some people. The studio audience was completely riveted now. This had gone far beyond a typical daytime TV interview. This was a cultural collision happening in real time. Whoopi decided to go for the nuclear option. Clint, I think what's really going on here is that you're having trouble accepting that the world has moved beyond the kind of outdated masculinity that your movies represent. And frankly, your defensiveness about it is just proving our point. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Eastwood stared at Whoopi for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but carried an unmistakable edge. Outdated masculinity, he said slowly. Is that what you call taking responsibility for your family? Protecting your community? Standing up to bullies? Because if that's outdated, then I'm proud to be outdated. But that's not what your movies show. Joy pressed on. They show men solving problems with guns, with violence, with intimidation. That's not protection, that's aggression. And what do you show? Eastwood asked, gesturing around the table. What do you contribute to society? You sit around this. Table every day tearing down people who actually create things, who actually build things, who actually contribute something to the world besides criticism and condescension. The panel was stunned. No guest had ever turned the tables on them. Quite like this. Whoopi's face flushed with anger. She wasn't used to being challenged so directly, especially not on her own show. For a moment, she seemed at a loss for words, but her fury quickly found its voice. "Excuse me," she said, her tone sharp and indignant. "We contribute plenty to society, Clint. We provide a forum for important conversations. We give voice to issues that matter. We hold people accountable for their actions and their words. You provide a forum for attacks," Eastwood corrected, his voice steady but cold. "You give voice to whatever's fashionable to be outraged about this week. And you hold people accountable to standards that change with the political wind." Sunny Hostin couldn't contain herself any longer. "That's completely unfair, Clint. We're trying to have a meaningful dialogue about representation and responsibility. In media, if you can't handle that conversation, maybe that says more about you than it does about us." Eastwood turned his piercing gaze toward Sunny. "A meaningful dialogue? Is that what you call ganging up on a guest and demanding they apologize for their life's work? Because where I come from, we call that something else entirely." "Nobody's ganging up on anyone." Alyssa tried to interject, but her voice lacked conviction. "Really?" Eastwood asked, looking around the table. 5 against 1 isn't ganging up. 5 people who agreed beforehand to attack a guest who came here in good faith to talk about his work. What would you call it?" Joy Behar, never one to back down from a fight, decided to escalate further. "We're calling it holding you accountable, Clint. Something that apparently hasn't happened to you very often in your privileged career." "Privilege?" Eastwood's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Lady, I started out digging swimming pools and working in a lumber mill. I got to where I am through 50 years of hard work, not through privilege. But I guess that doesn't fit your narrative either, does it?" Sarah Haynes made one last attempt to salvage the situation. "I think we're all getting a little heated. Here, maybe we can step back and find some common ground." "Common ground?" Eastwood looked at her with something approaching pity. "There is no common ground with people who think they have the right to rewrite history and silence voices they don't agree with. There's no common ground with bullies who hide behind righteousness." Whoopi had heard enough. Her mask of television politeness finally slipped completely. "Bullies? We're the bullies? Clint, you've made a career out of glorifying violence and toxic masculinity. And when we point that out, we're the bullies? That's rich." "What's rich?" Eastwood said, rising slightly in his chair, "is a group of people who have never faced real danger, never had to make life or death decisions, never had to put themselves on the line for anything, sitting in judgment of those who have. What's rich is career critics who think they know better than the people who actually do the work." "Career critics?" Joy's voice was shrill now. "We're journalists, Clint. We're commentators. We provide analysis and perspective. You provide opinions," Eastwood corrected sharply. "Loud, uninformed opinions dressed up as moral authority. And you think that gives you the right to tear down anyone who doesn't conform to your worldview." Sunny Hostin was practically vibrating with indignation. "Our worldview? You mean the worldview that says maybe we shouldn't glorify violence? Maybe we shouldn't perpetuate harmful stereotypes? Maybe we should be more inclusive and more aware of how our words and actions affect others?" "That worldview." Eastwood stood up slowly, his full height commanding the studio. "Your worldview that says art should serve politics. Your worldview that says creativity should be subordinate to ideology. Your worldview that says the past should be judged by the standards of the present and found wanting." "Sit down, Clint," Whoopi commanded, her voice harsh and authoritative. "We're not finished here." Eastwood stared at her for a long moment. And in that stare was 6 decades of Hollywood experience, 2 Academy Awards, countless iconic roles, and a lifetime of refusing to be pushed around by anyone. "Oh, we're finished," he said quietly. "We're more than finished." He reached up and removed his microphone, the small gesture somehow carrying enormous weight in the silent studio. "You know what your real problem is?" he continued, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You can't stand the fact that there are still people in this world who won't bow down to your moral superiority. You can't stand the fact that some of us still believe in individual responsibility, in standing up for what's right, in creating something meaningful rather than just tearing down what others have built. Don't you dare walk away from this conversation, Whoopi demanded, standing up herself now. Don't you dare dismiss us like we don't matter. Eastwood paused at the edge of the set and looked back at her one final time. I'm not dismissing you because you don't matter, Whoopi. I'm dismissing you because you've forgotten what does matter. You've traded wisdom for wokeness, principle for politics, and respect for righteousness. And that's not a trade I'm interested in making. Joy Behar jumped to her feet. So that's it. You're just going to run away because we asked you some tough questions? Tough questions. Eastwood's laugh was without humor. Those weren't tough questions. Those were accusations disguised as questions. Those were attacks disguised as dialogue. I've faced tough questions from real journalists, from serious critics, from people who actually understand the craft they're critiquing. What I got here was a lynch mob disguised as a talk show. The studio audience was completely silent now, unsure whether they should applaud, boo, or simply watch in stunned amazement as one of Hollywood's biggest legends dismantled the show's entire premise. Sunny Hostin made one final desperate attempt. Clint, please. We're trying to have an important conversation about representation and responsibility in media. Surely you can see the value in that. Eastwood stopped walking and turned back one more time, his expression mixing disappointment with determination. The only conversation happening here is 5 people trying to shame one person into apologizing for his life's work. The only responsibility being discussed is my responsibility to conform to your political beliefs. And the only representation I see is the representation of everything that's wrong with modern discourse. You don't want dialogue, you want compliance. You don't want understanding, you want submission. And you're not going to get either from me. With that, Clint Eastwood walked off the View set, leaving behind a panel of stunned hosts, a silent studio audience, and a moment that would be replayed and analyzed for years to come. Whoopi sat back down heavily, her face a mixture of anger and disbelief. For perhaps the first time in her career, she had been completely outmaneuvered by a guest. The great Whoopi Goldberg, who had made a career out of never being at a loss for words, sat speechless as the cameras continued to roll. Well, she finally managed, her voice shaky. I guess that's what happens when you try to have a real conversation with someone who's not interested in growth or accountability. But even as she tried to have the last word, everyone in that studio knew the truth. Clint Eastwood had just given them all a masterclass in dignity, principle, and the difference between standing up for something and simply standing up to someone. He had walked off that set with his integrity intact and his head held high, leaving behind a panel that had learned, perhaps for the first time, that not everyone can be bullied into submission. The legendary actor had proven once again that some people simply refuse to back down, no matter how many voices are raised against them. And in a world where capitulation had become commonplace, that refusal to bend had never been more powerful or more necessary. So what do you think? Was Clint Eastwood right to walk off the View set, or should he have stayed and tried to find common ground with the hosts? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for more stories about Hollywood legends who refuse to be silenced by the outrage mob.